I'm gonna wait to introduce new content for the class until after the project is due. But there is this last piece that I wanna talk about that's part of your submission, and that's to do a simple rendering of your precedent project, just to do a rendering of your little pavilion that you're designing. And I've actually been asked to do this on behalf of the third year instructors. In third year, you're going to be working with daylighting, and what they want you to be able to do is to simulate daylighting in your projects using your rhinoceros models. And so I'm going to be talking specifically about getting daylighting analysis into your Rhino models. For the master's students that I had, the grad students I had, we talked about rendering last year in digital fundamentals, but this is actually going to be slightly different than that, and I'll explain that in a minute. So there's something here for everyone. How many of you guys are accomplished renderers so far? Any you know? Okay, smattering. So the grads, mostly. All right. Okay. We, up until now, really haven't done much teaching of rendering. It's something that you kind of had to learn on the streets, you know? You had to kind of pick it up on your own. This is not going to be comprehensive, but I hope it's going to give you at least a leg up on how to do this, and it'll give us some vocabulary to talk about this if it does come up in the future. I think we saw some examples of rendering in the lecture the other day with Preston Scott Cohen. Which one's the rendering and which one is the building? Which one's a rendering? How many people think it's the one on the left? Okay, how many people think it's the one on the right? Yeah, the one on the right's the real building, actually. Can we adjust the lights? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's, you know, I always think also, this is a crappy resolution. I was trying to find a picture that actually matched the light fall, and that was the one I came up with on short notice. But Preston Scott Cohen, it was really tricky during the lecture. I don't know if you guys had an eye for this, but a lot of the images that he was showing were actually not the built project. Even some of the ones of built projects were actually renderings, okay? And this is almost why your professors don't want to teach you rendering, is because it's really easy to trick somebody into thinking that a project is realized or that it's figured out. The people who do these kinds of renderings, that's their 9 to 5, 24/7, 365 job. They do renderings. They're not the design architects. They're not the ones out there, talking to the contractors. They just do renderings. And so for you to take this upon yourself as a measure of quality for what you're doing in your studio projects is utterly insane. Okay? And I was this guy. When I was in school, I was always trying to go for the most realistic, rendering. I was most realistic materials and lighting. But even with advanced, the new tools we have with advanced computing, it's very difficult to pull off that standard. What the purpose of rendering is not to necessarily sell the design, and not necessarily to make a pretty picture, although that's kind of the reputation that it gets. It's actually to study the design in an iterative way. It's to experiment with different choices of materials, with different lighting conditions, and that doesn't require it to be photorealistic. All right. So I just want to put that out as a caveat for the kinds of things I'm going to be talking about, and just as a framework for the way you ought to be thinking about it. Rendering was really important to me when I was in school, because even though I was trying to get the best image, I was learning a lot about materials. I was learning a lot about lighting and a lot about cameras, because the computer, in order to perform the rendering, actually creates a physical simulation. Okay, and so you actually have to know something about light temperature. You actually have to know something about the emissivity of that pane of glass that you're rendering, right? You have to know something about the texture of the paint that you're putting on there, because it's actually going to diffuse light differently, and it gets very complicated very quickly. But again, I actually found it for me, it was a way to think about materials. It was a way to think about these things that I wasn't necessarily thinking about as deeply in studio, because I really wanted that image. I really wanted to understand that, how to get that. Okay. So it's kind of contradictory, but I do want you to really kind of caution you. It's good to have a nice beautiful image of your project, it kind of brings, it kind of wraps everything up into one picture. But don't like spend all your time, you know, on it. Don't like get too deep into it, because what's really important is to create a good design. Okay, it's not so much important to have these like fantastic images. It's an easy thing to get sucked into. Okay, or maybe it's just me, but. So anyway, Preston Scott Cohen, though, you know, makes pretty extensive use of them, especially because he does a lot of tricks with like perspective. It's very easy to create a virtual camera that has a really nice, distorted, you know, perfect perspective, and you can clean up any sort of, you know, things that don't look quite right. You know, you can. It really is just a way of smoothing away those imperfections in the design, which is why he likes to show those when he's talking about his projects, because they're about as perfect as it's ever going to be. Right? No one's ever touched it. Nothing leaked. You know, all the contractors did their jobs correctly. All the details are perfect. So anyway, that's rendering. So you know, why are we talking about rendering and computational methods? Allow me to justify my existence. Rendering is a computational method. It is process intensive. If you've ever done a rendering or seen someone do a rendering, your computer like hurts. Like the fans go on, you know, the thing heats up. Like it takes a long time because it's crunching a lot of numbers. The computers continue to get faster and faster and faster, and like, you know, things like Microsoft Word like maybe don't get any faster, or like Outlook or something like that. But one thing that is improving is like rendering speed as a result of advances in processor technology. You have multiple core processors. You have you know, increased like memory cache, increased RAM. I don't know about you, but other than video games, which are constantly rendering like 60 frames per second, like I don't use my computer to its fullest capacity except for when I'm rendering. All right, it's computational, it's thinking, it's crunching. Okay, and that's because, like I mentioned, they're based on physical simulation. So in order to get the image to like look correctly, it takes into account not only geometry, but lighting temperature, the direction of the lighting. The interactions of different kinds of lighting, the materials, so like the surface property of the material, the transmissivity of the material, the diffuse properties of it, and then it takes into account like atmospheric effects. It can take into account the lens of the camera, like the simulated virtual camera. So if it's a fisheye lens, or if the shutter's a different size or different like configuration, you can simulate all that. Okay. And that's how you get really physically accurate images. And we're going to talk about, actually, this is why we're even thinking about this right now, because we want to simulate daylight. Okay, and it's parametric. Like all these things are actually controlled parametrically within the program. There are numbers. Like you have to dial in numbers for each of these things, and you get a different result based on that. Preston Scott Cohen was in here actually talking about how in his firm they actually have developed a layer on top of their rendering software that allows them to control it parametrically. So they actually have an interface for the rendering interface so that they can crank these things out iteratively. And then lastly, you know, this idea that it's not for pretty pictures, it's an analytical method. So you compose a rendering of something and you change something and you compare that to the rendering, or you change a setting on the rendering and you compare that to like a previous rendering, and you kind of iterate through it. That doesn't mean that they're picture quality, but that does mean that you're testing ideas out, right? You're testing the light bounce off of a light shelf that you created, or you're testing a louver system versus another louver system that you made, all right? So that's the way that I use it, and that's the way that I would like you to use it, and probably your professors, is to use it as like an analytical tool in your design process. It can come into the process. Usually we think about it as like, it's like the last thing you do. It's like Sunday night reviews Monday. Oh, gotta make some renderings. You know, gotta go crank out some pretty pictures of this building. But you really ought to be thinking about it much earlier, like when you're in like schematic, when you're in design development. You know, you're testing out some of those big ideas. You're testing your material palette, like what you want to make the building from. You're testing the play of light off of a detail that you created, right? That's actually the design process, right? So it ought to come much earlier in your process, okay? So VRay is the primary rendering software that we're using in the university. This is different than even like last year. We had this other program called Maxwell, which I taught to the M1s last year. That still exists, but what we've done is supporting both programs was very expensive. Like we had a site license for VRay and a site license for Maxwell, and Maxwell increased their prices. So now we have a few copies of Maxwell that exist on specific machines. I don't know where those are. I think they're in 230. If you want to know, I will find out for you, but there's copies of Maxwell there. We are moving to VRay for the whole school. We have maintained the site license, so I'm going to teach you VRay because any computer that has Rhinoceros will use VRay, okay, has access to VRay, okay? VRay is a plugin for Rhino, so it's something that you buy extra that goes, on top of Rhino. It works with a lot of other programs. There's versions of it that work with SketchUp, that work with Studio Max. So it's something that if you learn it, you can apply it to other programs. Okay, but all these programs are interchangeable. Like I can export a model from one program into another, and and I can render it in Rhino, or I can export a Rhino and render it in SketchUp. So it really doesn't matter a whole lot. One caveat too is that it's not included with since it's not included with Rhino. That means you don't have it. That means even if you bought Rhino, you don't have VRay. If you want to buy it, I think it's $225. I do not recommend that you buy it. I don't think that you'll use it that much. I think that the school machines, have copies of it. It's certainly possible to start a rendering on a school machine and go get a sandwich, okay? And you don't need to have it on your laptop. It's going to tie up your machine anyway, right? Because it's going to be rendering. So go ahead and use the school machines, but do plan for that since you don't have access to VRay, that you're going to need to get onto a school machine at some point to produce your renderings for this project, okay? And for your studio projects, third years. All right. Anyway, so Maxwell. Well, let's get the next. Yeah, VRay versus Maxwell. Okay. So you don't even probably know much about Maxwell, most of you. Let me just tell you that the results of both programs are roughly equivalent. I would challenge you to look at them at a final rendering side by side and tell me the difference. They're roughly, the same. They're using the same physical ideas, but the processes for using them are different. Maxwell is kind of a fire and forget kind of thing. You just turn it on and you say I want so many iterations or I have so many minutes, and Maxwell does the best it can to get you a rendering. It's it's simple in a good way. But the problem with that is that you don't have a lot of fine control over it. So if you want a good rendering, you need to spend a minimum of say 10 to 15 minutes, right? Whereas with VRay, if you know what you're doing, you can get a really good rendering in 30 seconds, okay? But there's way more settings in it. So it's the difference between some kind of automated thing and something with a lot of parts, all right? And we have decided, we've come down on the side of VRay. And so what I'm gonna try to do today, as well as I can, is at least give you some insight on what those settings might be so that you can kind of still get renderings out quickly, but that have high quality. If you wanna try Maxwell, you'll feel free. But again, it's not like one is better than the other. They're just two different kinds of things. They're like Ford and Chevy or something, all right? They both get you there. They just get you there a little bit differently. So anyway, I hope that, if you had questions about that, I hope that it just sort of satisfies you temporarily. Yeah, so the big difference, why we even engage in any of this stuff, right? Well, Rhino has a renderer. So why do I even care about this thing? Is the fact that the image on the left is the Rhino default render. And yes, it casts shadows. Okay, you get a sense of the shadows. But the image on the right is the VRay render. And what are the differences that you notice between the two images? Soft edges? Soft edges on what? Shadows. Okay, good. Anything else? How so?
You can see in the windows, especially where there's a lot of the detail in the window, how that column sticks out. You get a lot more of an idea of how that feels.
Yeah, and it's the geometry is exactly the same in the two images, right? But what Eric is talking about is it actually kind of helps you understand that geometry more, the way that the light plays off of it, right? It's not necessarily more detailed, but the lighting is more detailed, right? You get this kind of spill, even actually to the point where it actually blows out the image. It's actually finer grained on my monitor than it is on yours, but you can see how that light actually pulls next to that pilaster in an interesting way, right? And how the shadow tends to sort of pool on the edges of the room. definitely the softer edges on the shadow, right? But look at that, this idea that there's these windows back here, and they're throwing, that's where the light's coming from, and they're throwing a lot of this light here. But look at how this shadow begins to, it starts out crisp, and then it becomes more and more, it becomes more and more blurry, okay? I mean, that's an actual sort of lighting effect. This would be like if you went outside this place and turned on a giant Hollywood spotlight and just blew the thing up, right? Like it just throws hard light like everywhere. Or it's like if you took a photograph of your model with like a desk lamp, all right? That's not like daylight, okay? The way that daylight works is that there's a big fireball out there in space and it's so far away from us, it's not a desk lamp, it's like billions of miles away, and the photons that it throws out are actually scattered, you know, and they're actually parallel. They're all kind of parallel. When you have something like this, they're so bright and they're so sort of like direct. There is not as much scatter with that. That's what that looks like. Now the difference in calculation is extreme. I mean, this thing is essentially just tracing lines. This is kind of like a Thomas Forget like perspective thing. It's tracing lines from a light source and it's using it to basically stencil the shadows on the image. Okay? This thing is doing something that's called photon mapping, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's really cool. It's like you took a big cannon full of paintballs and shot it into the room, and then you kind of smeared them around. All right? And that's actually how you get the different kind of blurry edges with this thing. And it's actually that's actually how photons work, right? They like ping pong around the room, basically painting it with light, and that's how you get these edges. Like, there are less photons here than there are here, but there's kind of like a gradient about that. Whereas here, there's no gradient at all. It's binary, right? It's either shadow or not shadow. Does that also seem really weird, like an academic? I mean, visually, you can tell the difference, all right? It's actually called indirect illumination or global illumination, and what that means is that the light gets into the room and it illuminates it globally, which means it literally bounces around the room, okay? This has no bounces. The one on the left has no bounces. It's just a stencil, okay? This is extremely fast to calculate. You'll notice it, right? Because again, you're not doing all this calculation, this photon mapping. Okay, so that's the difference. That's what we want, because this is actually more about like what's actually there. You can see the play of light on a detail. You can see like the way that the space is actually going to feel. You get that like slight shadow on the top of the column. You really begin to read the edges of the forms in like subtle ways. This is a lot closer to what you're going to get. And that's how you end up with things like this, right? Where you literally have light that's coming up here and bouncing off this and painting the wall. Same thing that's actually happening here where it begins to pool. You've got these little armpit shadows that are what happened in like the corners of rooms. Okay? That's really like realistic. When I started rendering, I started to notice these things in the real world. Like, you don't really pay attention to these things until you start to see them come up in your renderings, I don't think. You know, it's so odd that, I mean, that's actually what happens. Like, these little pools of shadow like collect in like the vertexes of each, you know, of the room's corners. You get these little pools of shadow that collect in these like folds, you know, and things. It's really quite something. And I don't know if you notice those kinds of things, but I sure did. Actually, notice this. It's interesting. In Preston Scott Cohen's rendering, look though at how he does kind of do a stencil shadow. He has a really like direct light shadow from that skylight down into the middle of that light fall, and you don't get that in the real building. And maybe it's not the right time of the day, but I find that kind of interesting. Like, he's really selling it for all it's worth there. All right. So, you know, just to talk about a few things here. So this is another example that really exaggerates, you know, some of the effects of this lighting. You'll notice, so there's actually a rectangular light, and the light's actually, you know, being thrown in that pattern of a rectangle. It's not a point. You notice, first of all, in the walls, what I'm talking about, how the corners of the walls and the edges actually become a lot darker. And around the like table, it's like there's almost multiple layers of the shadow. It's like very dark, and then there's another one that's kind of light, another one's kind of light, another one, and even with the chair, there's almost like multiple images of the chair in the floor, each in a different kind of gradient. That's because like you can almost imagine that square light is like 100 little tiny light bulbs, and each one's kind of throwing a little bit different shadow. And when you multiply them all together, that's actually what you get. So you begin to think about light differently. Like even the shape of a light in something, versus a light bulb versus a lamp, versus like a tube fluorescent that's inside of one of these square boxes actually throws light differently. And you can do this in the computer, experiment with this. And then if you built it, it's very similar. So I started to learn about light fixtures when I was, doing some renderings. And I don't know if you guys ever thought about that. I didn't. What shape of the light should it be? Okay. So there's an interesting effect here. What do you guys notice about the light on the wall with the pattern on the floor? What's that?
Pattern on the floor reflects it onto the wall.
It reflects. Yeah, it seems to, doesn't it? It's not actually reflecting though. What it is that there's just a difference in the light, right? Like black is going to absorb light and white's going to reflect light. You guys know that from science, right? And so what's actually happening is that the white checkers are slightly brighter than what's in front of the black ones, and it actually causes it to look like it's darker, and it causes it to look like it's reflecting. Okay? Whenever, so photons can be absorbed by different materials. That makes sense, right? So anyway, just interesting kinds of things. Like you actually start to notice these kinds of artifacts and things. You don't get this at all with other kinds of light. This is what's called the Cornell box, and this is a really famous rendering test. Every time there's a new renderer, this is like, you guys ever watch Top Gear? All right, this is like the Top Gear for renderers, okay? So they had the Stig, and he goes out in the that rendering engine, and they render the Cornell box. And the Cornell box it's this room with different color walls and two spheres that actually like reflect each other, and they actually like refract each other. And so it's doing a lot of computation, it's doing a lot of calculations. Photons are going in, and they're zooming through this thing, and they're going out, and it's really complicated. And they try to measure to see how accurate the effects are compared to a photograph of this that they have, and how fast it does it. And then, I don't know, and then they put them on a big chart, Anyway, there's a lot of things happening here that I want to describe to you because they refer to different settings in different renderers. This isn't just VRay. This is like every renderer that you're going to come into contact with. And there are things I think that are interesting architecturally. So if you have like a white space and you have a colored wall, those photons are going to hit that wall and they're going to bounce off of it, and they're going to like paint the next surface they hit with that color, basically. Okay. It's very exaggerated. So you notice actually that the wall is slightly bluer towards the blue wall. This is sort of like the effect of the checkered floor, but it's color. Same thing happens on the other side of the room. It's like if you had a big white room, it's perfectly immaculate. You painted it white and you put a big red rug in it, that room is going to slightly turn pink because of the way the light operates. All right? And Corbusier uses this in a lot of spaces, like when he has these really brightly colored surfaces. You guys remember like La Tourette? We're doing that right now in second year. The light guns, when they come in and they hit those painted surfaces, and then the light comes out and it's like yellow and it's green and it's blue and it's red. That's exactly what's happening here. You can simulate that in the computer. But there's a setting for this, and this is the problem with the computer though, is that you can always exaggerate the effect. So there's actually a setting. It's usually called color bleed, and you can just crank this thing up. So the room turns like purple. There's so much light being thrown off these. But so you have to kind of measure it against like reality. But it does happen, and the computer can simulate it. And there are these little pools of light that happen when you have a object that refracts light. I'm going to get in trouble with PETA. But have you ever tried a ant with a magnifying glass before? That's pretty much what happens. Is that the light gets sort of like compressed, gets sort of pooled by a magnifier. These are called caustics. And you get caustics with things like cut gems, magnifiers, and water. Like, in a swimming pool, when you're indoors and light comes off of it and you get these cool patterns on the ceiling, it's because the photons are going in and they're getting zoomed back up and they paint the ceiling. Those are caustics, okay? So In some rendering programs, there's like support for these. You can actually add in like these caustics, and you can actually simulate that. So again, I mean, they figured out a way to simulate most physical phenomena that occur with light. Yeah, I talked about this a lot already. The secret sauce in this is something usually known as photon mapping, and I want to show you a visual description of what photon mapping looks like. I've been using my hands a lot. I want to show you a picture. So this is a room that was modeled in the computer, and this is the first pass of like photon mapping. So I don't have an animation of this, but light goes into the room and it's colored, a certain color because lights have different temperatures. Sunlight's is a different temperature because it's burning hydrogen. A fluorescent light is, I don't even know what it burns or whatever, but it's slightly green, right? So different temperatures. It comes in at one color. It hits something, and depending upon the computer simulation, it bounces around, it picks up color, and it like deposits it a number of times, and you get a picture that looks like this. This is this kind of paintball effect. It splatters all this stuff all over the set. Each of these points is a point in space, but it has a color. Now you'll notice though, okay, so there's like dark spots. That's because it doesn't actually do every single. It takes a certain number of photons and it makes a calculation. In the real world, we're being photon mapped like trillions of times, per second, right? Every single photon is like painting everything, and that's actually what we see. This is just an approximation, okay? What the computer does, though, is it takes this and it takes samples of the image. So it looks at a square, and it looks at the different pixels, and it's like, okay, there's a red one, there's a dark red one, there's another red one, and there's another red one. If we average all those together, we get this kind of burnt umber. And then let's go ahead and say that that's what that pixel is. Based on an average of everything around it, that's what that pixel is, all right? And you end up with something like this. So it's kind of like an impressionist painting, okay? So the photons bounce around and they start to collect things, right? And then they just give you a general, sort of like a smear of the image, okay? Then the computer goes in one more time and it's like, okay, like that's pretty close to it, but that's not really gonna like look very good. And so it goes in again and it adds in the texture layer. So this is the light in the room, and it starts off white, and there's a wall that's a certain color, and so a lot of this light in the room is very red, right? Because the wall is red. This is the kind of red rug in the white room phenomenon. So this is just the light. Then the texture gets applied to it. So the different paint colors and whatever. And so that's actually affecting the color of the green chair. It's becoming slightly more red. The floor is actually a bit warmer because of the red. The windowsills are a bit more pink. And then lastly, the computer goes in and it finally averages in everything, and it adds all the reflections to it. And the reflections are generated by taking a rendering of the whole room and basically wrapping it around all the different objects that need a reflection. I'll talk about this in a bit, which is why reflections and things like glass are really expensive in the computer, because it's essentially like you have to make multiple renderings of the space before you can get those kinds of like reflections. That's how that works. It like takes a picture of it and then wraps it around the object. And then the last thing that it does is that it goes in and it does those final shadows. You can see the difference between the shadow. It looks at like the direct light and it applies it. So it has indirect light, color, texture. And that's how you get these like photorealistic images. Okay. It looks like a painting still, actually. And so just a few, so a really good example of this reflection actually is this mirror. So the mirror, the image gets rendered, and then this thing basically makes a camera at the position of the mirror, looks at the room, and then puts it back on the mirror. And that's actually how you get that image. Same thing with this mirror here, I guess. But it actually sees things that aren't in the original. Some things are not in the rendering, and it has to, basically create a different image than what you can see. Like the mirror sees things that maybe are not in this view of the model. Okay, so I want to talk about actually how to do this stuff now, but I hope that that gives you a little bit of an overview. And you don't need to take super detailed notes. I'm actually recording this, so don't worry. And the slides are going to be online too. Okay, so VRay. Assuming you have VRay turned on, I'm actually a little bit backwards here. Okay, first thing you got to do to use VRay is bake your geometry. This is assuming we're using Grasshopper, right? You can't render something that doesn't exist. And if you're in Grasshopper, you have to bake the stuff. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory, but I'm putting it in there. Okay, so once you have your geometry, what you're going to do is you're going to go into the renderer in Rhinoceros. So go to render, and you're going to change the renderer to VRay. By default, it's the Rhino renderer. It's the dumb renderer. Okay, so you need to change it to VRay. There's a 30-day trial of VRay, by the way, in case which you might be able to use for this assignment. But I just want to if that might not work for the whole semester for you, so you might use a school computer. Okay. Second thing then if you don't have them already, you want to add cameras. And we've talked about this a couple times. I won't go over it too much, but I do want to stress that it's important to have a good camera. So you want a view that really adds that helps you like analyze like what you see. Doesn't have to necessarily be eye level, but you certainly want to consider how the viewer sees the image. So you want to think about your rules of composition, like the rule of thirds. You want to think about the position of the focal point inside the image. So all the things we talked about in digital fundamentals and in second year, you want to take that into consideration. What are you trying to show? Not just like I want a pretty picture of it, but like what do I need to see? What does your reviewer need to see about your building? And you want to like basically consider your camera to be part of your design, and design a good camera or 3 or 4. Okay. It's important to have cameras too because as we see later on in VRay, you have a lot of control over the camera settings, but that begins when you actually have a camera object. If you don't have a camera object, there's much less control. Okay. So, and then you add a sun system, and the sun system, I'll show you this in a second, is a built-in parametric sun. It has these different controls for it. It seems really obvious, but you won't get one of these fancy schmancy renderings if you don't have lights in your model. Okay? Like you need VRay lights for it to work. So this is a good checklist to have. So I've got my model that I created for the video of this pavilion, and I have a camera that's okay. I get a pretty good sense of the whole site and of the form. It might be a little bit too balanced, but that's okay. So I have a camera though. I went ahead and got VRay opened up. Right, so to VRay. Then I'm going to add a sun system, and under VRay actually starts with these. It actually loads these icons. And what you want to do is you want to go to this little asterisk thing, and you want to say Add Sunlight System. Okay, and what this gives you, it gives you the sun angle calculator. Okay. And by default, it assumes that in your model, 90 degrees is north. What that means is that if this is my model, like by default, right, that up is north. If in your model, your studio model, like whatever, it's not, you need to adjust. You need to adjust it in the sun system. So let's go back and I'll take a look at that. Ah, that's inside. Okay, so sun system, and mine is 90 degrees north, but you can dial it in. So if you need to rotate the sun system so that the left side of your building is north, you could do that. What we're going to do though, we're not going to control the position manually. We're going to go through and we're going to use a sun angle calculator, and I don't know why it defaults to Africa, but it does. And I don't think Charlotte is in here. It might be. Nope, we're not popular enough. All right. But you could do something pretty close to it, like Washington, D.C. Hey, Omaha, Nebraska's in here, though.
Charleston was on there.
What is?
I think I saw Charleston.
Charleston? Okay, we do Charleston then.
West Virginia.
Charleston. Cairo, right? I heard Cairo. Okay, Charleston. Okay, so Charleston. Charleston. Close enough. Okay. Columbia. Okay. Shout out. Then you can go through and you can set the year and the date. So if we're doing it right now in like October, and then you could change the actual date time. You guys have talked about this, I think, with Dale about different times of day, right? In the morning, the sun's on the east, and it's gonna like illuminate that side of your building. As the day goes on, the sun gets higher in the sky, right? It's almost directly overhead, almost. It tends to stay towards the south, and then it sets in the west. And so, depending upon what side of the building you want to illuminate or what thing you want to test, you want to set that time of day and you want to set that time of year. So, are you studying like the solstice? Are you studying like the equinox? I tend to set mine. I tend to like to do the equinox, and I like to do it at 10 in the morning, 9:30, or 2, 3 in the afternoon. I want more light on the side of the building. I want to cast shadows that show me the volume of the building. I don't like, noontime sun is kind of bad because it just shoots everything like down, right? And so you don't get those good like volume shadows. You just get like this kind of like umbrella that's around it. So just if you don't know that or you don't believe me, test it experimentally. Okay, so I'm gonna set mine. It's October right now, but I'm gonna go for the equinox roughly. There. And 3 in the afternoon. Okay. And that's it. So you say okay, and that generates, and then it asks for a position for the camera. This doesn't matter a whole lot, but I would just make it up. So 0, 0, let's say 100 foot. It's not physically accurate, but you want it to be, up, okay, above your stuff. It doesn't really matter much after that. As long as it's aimed in the general direction, it's fine. It's the sun, it's going to shoot rays everywhere.
Should it be 1,000,000 miles?
It should be. It should be, yeah. And it would still work too. It actually doesn't matter how far away it is in this. But yes, so it's just, it's a simulation of the sun. Okay. Then the next thing you're going to do is add materials, and this is another caveat, is that unless you add VRay materials to your object, it won't behave properly, okay? This is a physical simulation, and so it needs to know like what color something is, like what the general surface texture of something is. Is it like reflective? How reflective is it? All that kind of stuff. Now it sounds really complicated, but I'm going to really simplify it for you. You're only going to have access, or you're only going to use 2 materials. Okay, and most of you are only going to use 1 material. You're going to have a big can of white paint, basically. Your thing is just going to be white, okay? And the other material is going to be glass, and that's because I've been asked to tell you how to do that by your professors. I don't think you necessarily need it for the assignment, but we'll look at it. So let's add materials. So if you go in to VRay, you're going to go to the material editor. And I kind of cheated because I did some of this before. Okay, so you're going to start with this thing that says scene materials and there's nothing in it. You are going to do 2 things. One, you're going to say add material, and you're just going to say add VRay material. Okay, and you get this sort of default material. Okay, and you go in, and so this is one that you created. And it looks like that. It's just a big gray lump, okay? To change the color of this, and this is a base material. It has like a matte finish. It's not shiny, right? It's like matte paint. And you can change the color by clicking on the color slider. And so if you wanted to do like a Ferrari or something like that color, you could change it. You have to click the preview update in order to see what it renders as. That's a little VRay render that it does to show you what the color is. Okay, you are going to do something like a very light gray. Okay, Some value like that. You know, you could use these values here, but I want something between light gray and white. Why would I not make it pure white?
Glare.
Glare? Okay. Good. More?
Makes your render do weird things when you have a perfectly white material, because there's no perfectly white materials in these.
There's no perfectly white material. That's good, right? Everything gets a little scummy. You know, it's not perfect.
When you lower the opacity or something of the material, you would lose it completely if it was white, wouldn't you?
If you lower the opacity enough, you lose anything, though. I mean, I don't think it has anything to do with the color. But I would say this about the reason why it gets messed up is because, you know, if it's white, there's nowhere to go up, right? It's white, you know. So what happens if it gets lit up? You know, you need a little bit of headspace to go a little bit brighter. Okay, so make your white like a little bit less than pure white. Same thing with black. Like always make your blacks like a little bit gray. Always desaturate your colors a little bit because you have to have room to play, right? Like that red could get like redder, you know, or it could get, you know, and that black could actually get darker. And in the same way, there's truly no perfect red, no perfect white, no perfect black paint. Okay? So anyway, just a heads up when you do that. So make your material, that's your default material. You can name it, you know, something funky, so that you know that it's yours. But don't do that. Just call it white something. And I can't change it. Well, it's stuck. No, I know. Okay, so I named it white. The other material that you're going to use is going to be one that's built in. I could teach you how to design a material, but I think it's just more than you need to know. So what you can do is go into Steam Materials again, right-click. You can go to Import Material. And by default, when you install this thing, or wherever it's installed, you will have a library called Materials. Use these at your own risk. They're pretty dangerous. I don't think your building wants to be car paint. Oh, question, Ryan. Sorry.
Well, Nick, a couple of times that I tried to do for our first project this year,
Yeah.
the materials were not loaded into the computers.
Okay.
So
That's probably good.
You might need to go into like VRay.com and like find the material palette, which are free.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. You can always download more materials and keep them on a key drive for yourself. But yeah, okay. But if you installed the demo, you'd have these. So I'll just give you this clear glass material. Just use the clear glass material. All right, that's relatively safe for consumption. So you can see that what the glass does, right, is it distorts the checkers. That's why the background's a checker. It's going to have some reflective properties to it, etc., etc. So that's glass, and this is white. Now the question becomes, how do you get the material on the object? Well, it's pretty easy. You pick an object, and then you open up the properties panel, which is usually like F3, or I think you can open it up. There's so many to open up in the menu. Go into the drop down and go to material, and then you go to plugin, browse, and then you can just say white, aka something funky. Okay. Okay, so now it's been applied, and you can actually apply it to multiple things at once. So I could go in and say plugin, browse, white. I don't know why it like drops out of there. That's really weird. Okay, anyway, I've applied my material. Do you guys have questions? Oh.
If you're throughout like the construction of your models, assigning different things to different layers, can you go in and just make one whole layer?
You can set it to a layer, yeah. Or you can, if you can't quite figure it out, just select everything on the layer and then just apply the material. Yeah, but yeah, you can apply materials in the layer interface, I believe, even if they're VRay materials. Yeah, but for this model, guys, it's just take a bucket of white paint to it. Okay, that's all you really need. I know, boring, right? But okay, so you have a material, you have a light. All right, let's kick the tires on this thing. So we're going to render this project, and I'm going to do two things. One, I'm gonna give you some files that have some built-in settings There are literally like hundreds of settings in VRay, and they're all really complicated. So I'm gonna give you files that you can use that'll just kind of baseline parameters for your model, but I'm also gonna explain some of the settings because I think depending upon your model, you may need to tweak the settings a little bit. Yeah, let's go ahead and look at that. So you go to VRay options, and this is all your stuff. This is your like F14 cockpit of render settings. All right, crazy. Couple of things. I'm gonna go ahead and go to like the defaults just so that you see what it looks like by default. The first thing is like the global switches. I would like, as soon as you sit down on the computer with this thing, I would go File, Restore Defaults. That way, in case someone did some stuff before you, you're not affected by it, okay? You're gonna start with a blank slate. Because one of the things that really gets me sometimes is that some people uncheck, lights, and they uncheck, shadows, and you're playing with all the settings, and you're trying to do stuff, and it's never gonna do anything because somebody unchecked the box for lights, okay? There's a reason why you might do that. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I just wanna like give you a heads up, okay, as a cautionary tale. Okay, so let's just render this and just see what we get. You can change the output here by going to Override Viewport, and when you're rendering your draft copies, you don't want to render it very big, right? Because you're not gonna blow it up and put it on a billboard. You just need to see what it looks like. So render it really small, like 320 by 240 at first, okay? Right, less pixels, less time. Makes sense. So first thing you're gonna do is just set it for a low resolution before you do anything. And then let's just give it a shot. So we go to render. And you can see this process of the sampling that it does. And it's crunching. See the little, you can't probably see the little sort of, these little sort of boxes? That's each one of my processors actually working on one of those sample areas. And then it takes a little while. So even for this image. So those little points are the samples, and then now it's like smearing them all together. And it's completely super white and blown out. Okay. Rendering is an iterative process. You're going to render something, and you're going to change it, and then you're going to render it again. And you're just going to keep doing it until it looks right, okay? I'll say this later, but you need to budget time for this. Even though this is a small piece of your assignment, and I'm going to give you a lot of the settings for this, you really want to make sure that you have enough time. This is not the kind of thing you do at the last minute.
If you put the light source further away, would it make it less blown out white, or
no? We'll talk about that. Yeah, that would be a good intuitive thing. If it were a regular light, yes, right? The distance from the light, there's an inverse relationship between the distance of the light and the intensity of the light, okay? Physics. The sun has so much light that it doesn't matter, okay? Unless you're on Mars or Pluto and further out. But on the Earth, it's pretty much going to be the sun, okay? What we need to do, actually, in this case, is change the camera setting. How many of you guys are photographers, photography? Hands up. Nick? Couple? No? Just Nick? Brad? Oh. Amber. She's just shy. Okay. You guys know about film speed? Oh, you all grew up with digital cameras, though. Most of you. Okay. This is going to be tough. Okay. So in film cameras, there are all these different settings, like the shutter speed and the aperture width and the f-stop and the film type, and that determines how much light the camera absorbs onto the film, okay? And that's actually how the camera works in VRay, okay? So you'll actually learn a little bit about cameras. What we're gonna do is change from the default camera to the physical camera. And now we have access to all these different controls. And let's go ahead and give this another quick render and see what comes out. You notice already it's darker because we're engaging that physical camera. Crunch. Oh, okay, better. Much better, okay? So the difference is in the camera that we use, okay? Because the camera is absorbing the light and it's producing the image. Much better, Don't you think? I need a minute alone with this rendering. Okay. What's that, Ryan?
Why didn't we get any shadows with the default camera?
We did, but the sun was just so bright it blew them out. Like the light was absorbed, it's just too much. Little skittering computer processes, you know. It's the best visual representation of computation.
Is the process the way it's moving around? Is that because it's picking up all the pieces that are similar?
It actually processes it quasi-randomly because if it processed it in linear order, the light from one box would get to another box, and yeah. I mean, if you want a full explanation of it, I can talk about more. But it's basically they figured out the most efficient way to get the best image, and that's actually what they call sort of like the bucket order. These are like buckets. My computer is like, the fan is totally going off now. It's very hot. But you notice now, look at this, how the light bouncing off the flat side of the building is actually illuminating this side of the wall that has the cast shadow, and because there's less of it, it's getting darker on this side. And so the light, filters through, this box. What are you guys laughing at? What now? Okay. Wouldn't you want someone to be excited about this? I would totally. All right. But okay, so pretty good though, right? And so this might do just fine. If you use the default settings, you might be totally fine with your model, okay? Things that you need to watch out for are like light leaks. So what you have is, if you didn't model this very well, if there's like a seam in it, if it's not well crafted, a stray photon or two can get in there and you'll see like a little bead of light coming through there. That means you need to go back and fix that little piece of your model. You also might need to increase the number of samples, and I'll talk about that in a second, right? More samples means more precision, which would actually figure out that there's actually not a hole there. But that also increases the amount of time it takes, right? There's more processing. So that's the fine art of like rendering. Actually, is essentially balancing the number of samples that you need to process versus the final quality of the image. The best rendering tool that you have is Photoshop. Okay, I'll repeat that. Okay, Photoshop is actually the best rendering tool. If you have a problem with your rendering, and rendering, like, again, won't solve it. Like, you cannot figure out the setting. Like, it's not, you can't figure out the samples. It's taking forever. Clock's ticking. Open up Photoshop and, fix that. Like, do like a copy clone or draw a box around this and just smear the thing into it, okay? Professional renderers spend more time in Photoshop by like a factor of 3 than they ever spend rendering the stuff in the first place. That's the secret, okay? They're tweaking the contrast of it. They're actually adding texture in after it's been rendered. A lot of the times they don't actually add any texture. It's just like this. They use this to get the light, and then they take the texture and they tweak it with the perspective tool in Photoshop and they layer it on there. And sometimes they even just paint shadows in. Okay? Don't assume that this stuff pops out of the computer like fully formed and like perfect. You'll drive yourself absolutely crazy. Photoshop is your best friend. You go in and just fix this stuff. If it's not working out, like for instance, my spider sense would tingle because of those little shadows on the top of the wall right there, right? Because that's actually a model problem. That's because when I baked it, these things are hanging over slightly and they're causing a cast shadow. That is like a 2-second job in Photoshop. How long would it take you to go back, model it, go back, render it, put it back in there, right? Don't waste your time. Photoshop, okay? Okay, let me quick show you some of the settings for this thing. But for the size of the model that we have, the default settings work pretty well. This is a relatively complex model, and that didn't take me very long at all. That's relatively print quality. You probably want to, if you want to print these out, you need a higher resolution. I think you guys know that at this point, right? You need to render them at a higher resolution. So 1600 by 1200 is great for like an 11 by 17, a full size. So just think about what your final output's going to be, and also choose the output size. What I don't like to see is a little one that's just blown up, right? It's going to be all pixely and junky. Okay, but this is really something. Like, look at those, the crisp shadows. Look at the shadows that are a little bit blurry. Actually, I'm going to go inside this thing and do rendering. Okay, so I have a camera inside. Might not be a bad idea. Let's just see what we got. But you see how it's essentially, these are the samples. The first pass is just looking at these things in a very very kind of coarse grain. And then the next pass, and the computer's going through, and it's going to refine them slightly. It's kind of cool on the big screen. And the more some of the other computers like the DArts lab have 16 cores. They're going to render this 4 times as fast, but your standard MacBook has 4 cores. Again, other than video games, I'm not sure where you even use that sort of thing, but it becomes important. Can you hear my computer? Okay. But you see, so there's the actual wall, and then these are the actual photon collections. And it's not rendering like the actual sunlight that's falling on it in like a direct pattern. This is just the indirect light in the scene. The direct light comes afterwards, because that's the stuff that's just the spotlight, right? That's the stencil light. So it's actually multiple overlapping, and for each light in the scene, it might have a stencil, or it might have a different photon pattern. This is actually very simple, right? Because it has one light. Okay, not super. I thought I was going to get more. The play of the roof on this piece was what I was interested in seeing. Do you notice something though? This is actually interesting here. Do you see how this is almost kind of splotchy? That's because there's not enough samples in order to kind of smooth it over, right? There's a little bit of missing information from one collection of points to another, okay? That's a sure sign that it's a rendering, first of all, if you ever need to know. You have to ask yourself, is this acceptable? When you're presenting this, for something like that. I would say for most intents purposes, it is acceptable. It's just enough to get the idea of it. But if you're a real perfectionist, these kind of, I don't even know if you see this. I really see it on mine. There's these little tiger stripes, these little splotches, especially on that sidewall over there, okay? What you could do is 2 things. 1, increase the samples, go back and render it. Or 2, go into Photoshop, and it works on a flat wall. Just draw a box around this thing, and then just Gaussian blur it. Just blur it a little bit more until you blow those away. If you blur it too much, you lose any fine detail, but if you blur it enough, you'll save yourself a trip to the render again. All right? Same settings, but there's not enough information to render the interior accurately. Ryan?
Do you have a tutorial about some Photoshop tricks?
Carrie's, yeah, there's one from my other class that has some tips. The things I'm talking about, though, guys, are just using the eyedropper and painting, or using Gaussian blur. They're not advanced by any means. They're just photo editing stuff.
All you have to do is go on YouTube.
Yeah, just tons of tutorials. Yeah, this is going to join them pretty soon here. Okay, so yes, there are lots of tutorials online. You can look up rendering Photoshop tutorials. Yeah. There's actually an architecture. There's a page called CG Architect that has a lot of tutorials for this kind of thing. Okay, I want to talk. So I talked about these things just increase the samples. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, if you go into the indirect illumination, oh man, this thing needs to get. There we go. What? Actually, not this one. So by default, we're using an irradiance map, and there's these different settings here, and what you want to pay attention to are these 4 things here: min rate, max rate, subdivisions, and samples. Okay, I'm going to try to explain this simply as I can, but let me know if it's confusing. So min rate and max rate refer to the number of pixels that the computer uses when it determines what the final pixel color is going to be. Okay? A rate of 0 means that it looks at 1 pixel and then it decides what to make that 1 pixel. The negative numbers mean that it actually skips several pixels, so it just says like, like I'll have what this pixel's having over here, and they're actually, this is confusing, they're factors of 2. So -3 would mean 8. That's 2 to the 3rd power. It would mean that it's looking at 8 neighboring pixels and it's just kind of smudging them. If I would increase this rate to like 3, that actually means that it looks at 8 pixels to decide what 1 pixel is. That's a much finer like sample. Okay. The distance between the min rate and the max rate, so -3 to 3, is like 6. That means that there's 6 passes. So it goes through, it smooths it, goes through and smooths it. It will do it 6 times. All right? So you need to balance these numbers out for yourself so that you avoid too many passes, because there's a point of like diminishing returns when it just processes it so much you're never going to get a finer result. Okay? And you're just wasting your like computer time and your time. If you wanted to do a quick rendering of something, just to get a base. You could do something like, say, I just want to look at between -6 and -5. Okay. What's that? Oh. So you can see how big that is, like how big that starts off, and then it just kind of quickly. So see how fast that one was. Okay. But let's look at the detail that comes out of it then when it actually finishes the wall. But this would be something that you would do so that you just understand what you're getting, right? It's not a final rendering. Okay, so I don't know if you noticed this, but look at how much less detail there is up in that under there. Like there's not a lot of shadow pooling. Actually, there's no shadow. It's pretty flat, right? There's not a lot of shadow in this corner. Do you guys see this, or does it look like less detailed? Okay. What's that? Yeah. Okay. It might be subtle. I don't know. It's not to me, but so there's that, right? And then if I went the other way, and I won't do this, but if I said something like, okay, the minimum is going to be 0 and the maximum is going to be 3, it's the same number of passes, but much more calculation. Okay. And in fact, it's going to look first at each pixel, and then it's going to look at like 2 and then 4 and then 8. So it's going to be much more fine-grained. You won't even see it on the screen actually. That would be your final pass. Okay, that's going to take a while. But when you're confident the light's right, the camera's right, the mood is right, you're going to go ahead and you're going to set the samples a little bit higher. All right. The last piece of this that can affect it. So I talked about that it's using a certain sample per pixel, or it's using 8 samples per pixel. Okay. How do you know how many samples there are? Well, you actually set the rate. You can set the rate here. So right now it's looking at a global pattern of 20 samples subdivided 50 times. So it's like each one is divided 50 times. So whatever 20 times 50 is, 1,000, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, my math is terrible. If you increase this number, it's going to take longer, but you're going to have more samples. So if you have a lot of fine detail in something, you would want more samples. Okay. And then if you increase the subdivision, so every time you increase one of these, so you increase this number, you're going, so it's like each one of these gets sampled 50 times. So if I increase it to 60, it's going to increase it 60. It's going to increase it, each one's going to be looked at 60 times. Okay? So these numbers can control it. Don't go crazy with them. A setting of 50 samples subdivided 100 times is pretty good. 200 times is like crazy. 300 times, it would never finish. You would just have, your render would never stop. Okay? So just, if you're going to play with that, it depends on what you're doing, but that's something you can play with. So you can play with the sampling rate and the number of samples and the number of subdivisions. if you're interested in that, that's actually how you get like a quick rendering, you know, and you can play with the quality of the rendering. So like you can have a lot of samples, but you're just not looking at very many of them, or you can have you're looking very closely at a small number of samples. So there's actually different for different types of renderings, different types of things make sense. You just have to experiment with it yourself, but you don't have to worry about that for the most part. Because what you can do is when you're in VRay, you can go to File, Load, and there's actually some of these that are already built in. And so you can go in and you can say like, I want a low resolution version of a GI, you know, like rendering, you know, or a very high version of that. So you can start by using the low and doing a rendering, and then when you're ready, fire up one of the higher resolution ones or fire up one of the studio quality ones, and that might just take care of it for you. But if you're really interested in mastering this and really like getting the best performance for, you know, in the most efficient way, you got to do the F14, you know, cockpit. You got to dive into some of these commands. There is a very extensive PDF that I can give you that actually has a visual like description of what each of these things does if you're so inclined. I'm going to post it online for you. But 99% of you don't really need to worry about that. So I would go ahead and just, for this project especially, I think these files are probably helpful. So they're just going to set the settings for you automatically. Okay? Okay, let me quick. Any questions about the rendering process, though, before I finish up here? Clear as mud? All right. If you remember to, you know, put a camera in, put materials on, put a light in it, use the default settings, make the image big enough, you're pretty much to like 85, 90%, you know, there. Okay. I think it's pretty, especially for this project, it's pretty standard. If you run into trouble, you know, let me know. Let you know, you can talk to Yashka too. A couple of final notes I want to say about this. Pay attention to the ground, or like to the background of your piece. You can change the rendering background in Rhino. If you go to Render Properties, you can change the background color. So if you want to do a white, you know, background, you just change that swatch to white. Okay. You can also go into Environment, and you can actually add a background. Hang on a second. You can change the. There should be a map here. Yeah. You can add a sky to it, and a sky map is actually going to basically give you kind of like a blue sky in the background. So if you go into the M here and change the type to sky. Okay. So that's also something, and that's actually going to slightly, depending upon the time of the day, it's going to slightly give you a different color. So if it's like evening, everything's going to be kind of blue. If it's if the sun's setting, it's going to be slightly red, just slightly. Okay. So that's kind of a gimmicky thing. I might not worry about that too much, but the idea is, I'm going to change this back to none here. The idea is that you want to think about like what's in your background. Like I don't want to see a bunch of renderings where everything is like black and it's floating in space. Okay. Really consider that. If you have trouble with it, you can also Photoshop the background if you need to. But really kind of pay attention to that. That's something that the professors don't like. I don't like it. If you need to extend the ground plane further so that it's not just floating in space, you can do that as well. Okay.
Use the infinite plane.
You can do it. Well, yeah, you could do infinite plane in. There's a little thing here that's called Add VRay Infinite Plane, and what that does is it just puts an infinite plane out there, and you want to add a material to the infinite plane also. Add that gray or that white to it. Good call. So yeah, that way it's never floating because it's resting on infinity. No.
How do you select that?
You don't. It's infinite. What's that? Oh, you can select it, yeah. I just selected it. I was just joking. Yes, that makes sense. You might make your ground plane for your pavilion a slightly darker material just to differentiate it. That's easy to do. You guys know how to do that by now. Okay. Yes, make sure you give yourself enough time. Seriously, this is not the kind of thing to procrastinate. Okay, real quick. So there are some VRay materials available online. Yes, there are things like Fraggle fur. That's actually grass, but most of them are kind of gimmicky. But I do want to talk about a couple of things that might, if you remember this conversation later, all right, or you're watching this video later, I want you to remember some of these things. They're not relevant to this project, but they're relevant to rendering in general. Okay, so give me a minute to show you something. Transparency maps. I think some of you guys, I've talked to you about this in your groups, with one of the particular projects had this like perforation on it. And I said like, you don't model the perforation, like you don't literally like drill the holes in the model, what you do is you fake it with an opacity map, okay? And so there are textures that you can make and that you can download that have what's called an opacity map. And what it is it's basically a black and white texture that tells the computer whether something is transparent or it's a gradient or it's totally opaque. And it actually, the computer, when it does the simulation, when it does the rendering, will allow light to pass through it or be obstructed by it. And so this is actually a quick way to do things like this chair, for example. Imagine an auditorium of these chairs, and you had all these models. Every time you drill a hole in it, that's like more vertexes, you know, and you do it like 1,000,000 times, the thing would never, it would be a huge file. This is like a 24 kilobyte texture. And this chair just has a flat back and a flat front, and it just maps to that chair. Okay? When you render it, that's actually what you get. It's extremely cheap, like for the computer to do that. So things like cyclone fences, fret patterns on like glass, perforations and things are texture maps. Okay? They're transparency maps, and you want to look for those. And if you need them for your projects, talk to me. I'll help you make one. All right? But you do not model that sort of thing unless you're only modeling one, okay? Because the problem with a transparency map is that it has no depth, right? Like if you zoomed into this, it's like Wile E. Coyote painted like a hole in something, right? It's totally fake. If you zoomed into that, there's no gauge to that metal. There's no thickness at all. From far enough away though, it looks great. No problem, right? But if you get in close, if you get close enough to read it, it's just a surface with like a hole painted on it. Okay? That makes sense? Good enough though. Bump maps are another thing. So some of you guys do things like, modeling every individual brick in a building. You don't do that. There's actually, you can do that with textures. You can do what's called a bump map. And a bump map is a black and white map as well. And what it does is that it tricks the lighting algorithm, and it basically gets treated when the light gets painted on it as if it's coming out or as if it's being like recessed. Okay? You can't really tell, but this has the same problem as the other one, the Wile E. Coyote problem. Is this is essentially just painted onto this thing. If you got in really close to it and you look at the edge of it, it's the same edge as the original teapot. It's a smooth edge. It just looks like it's got texture on it.
Is this something you would add through like material quality with the render of it?
Yeah, there's a material slot for like a bump map and something like that. When you download one of these things, you have the bump map. You can adjust the intensity of the effect in it. It's purely a material like property, all right? But I just want to give you guys a heads up, right? Like what would be, think about modeling each individual like brick in something, in a whole wall, or having one surface that just has like a repeating like map on it. Think about what's cheaper in the computer. Okay? The effect is actually the same in the rendering. It's going to show up exactly the same. It's actually nicer because you get this little sort of like, and this isn't like geometry, but you get like these little sort of like irregularities and pockmarks and like character with it. Try modeling that, right? You can't. And then there's different like layerings of effects. I apologize for the image, but when you layer these things, so you have bump maps, you have transparency maps, you have what's called like a shader. You layer them together, you can, this is actually how video games work. The geometry in video games is like really undetailed. Like you would be amazed. If you turned off all the textures on this, there's so little going on in the computer, but the textures, when you start to layer them together and you combine them and you put them in the right place with the right lighting, you can completely fool the eye. And that's how video games are able to do so many frames per second. They're not that fast. Like the machines that are running them are not that fast. It's just that the graphics cards can handle these textures on them, okay? So this works, this has applications in architecture. If you're going to be like making a model, really good modelers spend most of their time working on materials, okay? They don't actually model all the little widgets and things, like they fake it by layering materials together. So Photoshop is a huge tool for architectural like renders. It's not necessarily how good a modeler you are or how good a renderer you are, okay? Which is actually a lot of what we spend our time on, but it's actually about your sensitivity to material design and to like color and to lighting and to being able to do the corrections in Photoshop that actually gives you that final, look. And it'll end with that gory scene. All right, thank you guys.